One of the most important questions every board faces each year is, how much do we need to set aside to care for our common areas? The answer to that question is found in the reserve study. In this portion of our Reserve Study Basics webinar, I'll provide a big picture overview, introducing the 3 types of reserve studies, the 3 parts of a reserve study, and the 3-part test guiding the selection of reserve components. 3 main points, each with 3 elements. The numbers aren't hard, and even the results are simple. For most associations, it boils down to needing to set aside about a quarter, or 25%, of your total budget towards reserves. Your association may need to set aside a little bit more, or maybe a little bit less. A reserve study helps you know where you're at and gives you a plan to get where you need to go. So now back to our outline. It's time to dive into reserve study topics, the reserve study tool, and see how a board can make wise, informed decisions about paying that deterioration bill. Well, I start off by talking about the 3 types of reserve studies. We talk about reserve studies, there's actually 3 types, almost like when you go to a gasoline station and there's 3 typically levels of fuel that you can get there. In reserve studies, there's 3 types. There's the full, and then 2 update products, update with site visit, update no site visit. A full is the level of service where you start basically with a blank sheet of paper and you itemize, inventory, evaluate, and quantify all the common area components. You measure the roof, you measure the asphalt, you count the light poles, you measure the square yards of carpet. All that stuff is inventoried and evaluated and quantified in a full reserve study. And once that information has all been established, then you have a much smaller project in the future, and that's updating it. And you can update it on the basis of a diligent site visit where you're looking at things. How is the carpet doing? How is the roof doing? How is the asphalt doing? All those kinds of things. You put your eyeballs on them, you make observations, and you see, is it deteriorating on schedule, faster than expected, or slower than expected? And then there's the update no site visit where you're getting a nice, inexpensive update based on the time that has lapsed. Everything's a little bit older. There's been some inflation in the last year. How has the reserve balance changed? Have you changed your interest earning rate? Has the board priorities changed? It's all those kinds of things you can get done very inexpensively in an update no site visit. Now, there's a different way to look at this, and that's the way of looking at it that a reserve site, generally a full, only needs to be done once for an association. Once you've measured the roof and measured the asphalt and counted the boilers and itemized how big they are, that information exists, doesn't typically change. But now National Reserve Study standards, after Champlain Towers South, the national best practice is for a with site visit at least every 3rd year. That's because things change with time. And so you can see the asterisk there. That's new information. Every 3rd year is national best practice. And some of you are in states where the state law says you need to do this at least every 10 years, at least every 5 years, at least every 3 years. But I'm telling you that it's in the best interest of the association. Special assessment risk goes down significantly when you update your reserve study with a site inspection at least every 3rd year. It's in your best interest. And then it's also in your best interest to, I'll tell you this a little bit later, because reserve funding is such a significant portion of your budget, it's important to keep it well tuned, aimed correctly. And so a no site visit update, a great inexpensive tool to tweak your reserve funding rate, get it adjusted, and aim at the future, again, very inexpensively on an annual basis. You don't want to be dealing with old information. And then it almost, sometimes people say, well, how do you game the system? How do you win this game? Well, let's talk about what the rules to the game are. Full reserve rules, pretty simple. The expenses are inevitable. I hope I've made that very clear. The board is responsible for setting the budget. You all know that. You're members of this industry. Delays get expensive due to the higher costs of deferred maintenance when you delay. Project scope creeps, and you've got more to do. Instead of just painting the woodwork, now you're doing painting and carpentry. Instead of just sealing the asphalt, now you're sealing and repairing. So doing it in a timely manner keeps costs to a minimum. And speaking about costs, the homeowners are always the ones who get stuck paying the bills. And those simply are the 4 reserve rules, kind of the rules of the game. And some of you are saying, well, it's not required in my state. And I'm going to say, well, that's really not the point. As I've said before, Mother Nature and Father Time really don't care what the laws in your state say. Board members are responsible for the common areas everywhere, and deterioration exists everywhere. So in order to keep your budget balanced, in order for you to pursue your personal best interests as leaders of the association, as homeowners in the association, as board members in the association, you want the place well taken care of. You want enough cash so you can do the roof project on time, enough cash so you can do these other things. It's in your best interest to budget for the needs of the association, to be able to pay your ongoing deterioration bill. So to get this done, you're going to have 3 questions. What do we reserve for? Do we have enough at this point in time? Or are we behind the 8 ball to start with? And where do we go from here? What do we need to do to get successfully and safely to the future? Well, fortunately, there's 3 parts of a reserve study that answer those 3 questions. So let's start with the foundation of a reserve study, which is the component list. That's where you're going to find out what are we reserving for. And this is a typical component list. I've simplified it here, but you're going to see the 4 elements: description of the project, the useful life, which is UL, the remaining useful life. You may also hear it described as remaining life, RL, and the current cost. What's the cost today to get these things done? And another thing to point out is these are project descriptions, not physical assets. You can see here we've got 2 projects that you're going to do to the same physical asset. Asphalt is a physical asset, but every 5 years you're going to seal it, and maybe every 20 years you're going to need to resurface it. Very different time cycles, very different cost amounts. And the roof, replace it, pool furniture versus the resurfacing of the pool, and that's a segue to the next thing. But we're talking about description of projects, useful life, remaining useful life, and current replacement cost. And you say, well, what project should appear on our reserve study? Well, the answer to that question is found in National Reserve Study Standards. There's a 3-part test. That 3-part test is that to be funded through reserves, it needs to be the association's obligation, basically common area, so not something that the developer owns, not something that the management company owns. So when we go into the on-site office, we ask who owns this desk, who owns this computer. If it's the management company, we don't itemize it for the reserve study, okay, because it belongs to someone else. And also furniture, patio furniture, 99% of the time it belongs to the association. But if we see some matching pieces on balconies, we ask, are those individually owned pieces on balconies, or are those association pool chairs that someone brought up to their balcony? Okay, we're going to find out, is it the association's obligation? Number 2, needs to be reasonably anticipated. Can we see this project coming? Reserves are not for guessing. It's projects that we can see coming that the board is going to get slammed with if they don't prepare. And that's because reserve projects need to be of a significant cost, a cost threshold that it would upset the operating budget if you were to cross your fingers and hope it could be absorbed. So we're talking about significant projects that when we spread them out, it takes years to properly prepare. Then you think, years to prepare? Oh, offsetting ongoing deterioration. It comes full circle here, where you have to reserve for things that are the association's obligation, they're reasonably anticipated, and they're a significant cost. So in summary of the components, the question is, what do we reserve for? What we're talking about is major projects that you can anticipate with reasonable certainty that are the association's obligation to repair or replace. So we're not talking about trivia. The mops and buckets and light bulbs, do those from the operating budget. There's no guessing because we know that there's going to be a failure of the roof eventually. Roofs fail. We're not going to guess about things that might happen. So guesses are still maybes. They don't appear in the reserve budget. We want you, with your reserve budget, to look at that and therefore not be surprised by the things that are not surprising. All right? Reserve components are there. They're going to deteriorate, and we don't want you to be surprised by something that deteriorates in plain sight over X number of years. That's just foolishness. Okay, so now we get to the question of, do we have enough? And that's a question that's answered in the portion of the reserve study where we calculate reserve fund strength. Now, an important word there, we calculate reserve fund strength. You can look at the reserve balance by looking at the balance sheet. Find out how much money you have in account number 1, account number 2, account number 3, you add them all up, and you have $300,000 in reserves, or $100,000, or $3 million in reserves, whatever the number is at your association. We're going to calculate if you have enough. We do that by balancing the value of deterioration at your association to the reserve cash at your association. There should be a balance. We're trying to make sure that your association is on track. And let me give you this hypothetical. Think with me. If you have a brand new association, sparkly, shiny new, you don't need much in reserves because nothing has deteriorated. The ongoing cost of deterioration, it's been nothing. You're brand new. You're a year or two old, close to nothing. But if you're an old association where you have a lot of deterioration, the roof is old, the siding is old, the asphalt is old, to be in balance, you're going to want to have collected a lot in reserves over the years so that you're ready to spend that money on a new roof, new siding, or to resurface the asphalt. What we want to prevent here is the case like we show here in this picture where the deterioration gets way ahead of your cash. And that's a dangerous situation because you don't have enough cash to keep up with the expenses that are now coming at you left and right. So we measure this with a parameter, a number that's called percent funded. And this is the industry standard measure of how well your reserve cash balances against your reserve deterioration. Being in balance is the 100% point. Not too much cash, not too little. You're balanced left and right side. And that tells you a lot more than how much cash do we have, X amount of dollars. You say, well, that's nice. We have $300,000 in reserves, but is that enough? Okay, so we calculate your percent funded, and that's insightful because knowing your percent funded reveals your special assessment risk. Because if your association doesn't have much cash, you're at a high risk of special assessment when the project comes due and you don't have the money. That's just a known fact. So we add those numbers up, and this is the statistical relationship across the country of special assessments compared to percent funded. It's very easy to see that special assessments are more common when, relatively speaking, you don't have much cash. That makes total sense. So we're in the roughly 30 to 50% range, meaning every third year or every other year when you have effectively very little cash at the association. So when you're 0 to 30% funded, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, you have a high risk of special assessment. Now, the opposite is true. When you're above 70% funded, you effectively have enough cash to be able to write the checks and pay the bills and get a new roof when it's old, get a new siding, resurface your asphalt, take care of the building because you have enough cash on hand. So knowing your percent funded is important. It helps you know, are we doing okay? Are we in catch-up mode as you would be here on the left? Or are we well prepared for the expenses in our future? And then we get to the third portion of a reserve study, which answers the question, what do we do from here? And that's called the funding plan. And of course, whatever number you get, it's going to seem like a lot of cash. It's going to feel like a wheelbarrow of money. That's just the way it is. You add up 9 units or 90 units or 900 units, look at the recommended reserve transfer and you're going to say, wow, that's a lot of money. But you do need to get comfortable with the fact that owning real estate is expensive and the cost of deterioration is expensive. What I can tell you in summary is that, and this is a good takeaway, what we find in all the reserve studies that we've done is there's a pretty nice little thumbnail summary that reserve funding typically needs to be 15 to 40% of the average association's budget. If you want to have a visual, I made this 1/4 here. It's typically a little bit more or a little bit less than the 25% point. So if you have a $1 million budget, $250,000 of that should be going to reserves, leaving $750,000 for operating fund. That's classic standard reserve funding at an association. So don't think that your association is going to sneak by with 5% of budget, and don't worry that unless you're a real steep catch-up mode, it's going to cost 50% of budget. And your funding plan, using that money, is going to provide for the anticipated projects at your association. These are the scattered expenses through the years. Remember, this is all due to deterioration that happened over many, many years. But having the cash means that when you have reserve projects, the cash goes down. But in years that you don't have expenses, your cash balance goes up. And so you always have enough money to pay the expenses and have enough cash to do the projects at your association. Now that kind of looks like success. And I say kind of because nothing ever happens exactly according to plan. You need some margin. So your reserve study provider, count on your reserve study provider to recommend a multi-year funding plan that provides an appropriate amount of margin for the projects that inevitably occur a little bit early or a little more expensive than projected. The green line in this slide. At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you want to join us in this mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below on what you'd like to see us address in a future video. Let's plan for your best future.